Hades has one of the most comprehensive and well-balanced difficulty systems ever seen in the roguelike genre. The modular heat system gives control back to the player to allow them to decide how they want to be punished. But this kind of system comes at a price. In order to give players enough variety, the developers needed to add more packed options than were actually reasonably possible to beat. So what does happen when you max out the heat gauge in Hades, and why has no one beaten it yet? Hello, my name's Haelian, and I cover Hades and other roguelike games here on this channel, and today we're going to talk about the Pact of Punishment and how the developers accidentally created an impossible challenge that no one has truly beaten almost 3 years later. I spoke with members of the high heat community and discussed what makes it just so difficult, and also what does it take to actually beat a run like this. First, let's talk about the pact and overall setup. The maximum heat you can have in Hades is 64 if you're using a Hell mode save file, so that's what we'll be discussing today. Hell mode adds the personal liability pact, but otherwise doesn't change anything else about this particular challenge. What builds are viable here though? Which weapon and aspect should you use if you attempt this? Well, within the high heat Hades community, it has been determined that your best chance at success would be to use the shield and aspect of Zeus. There's really no point in even trying to use anything else, and we'll kind of talk about why that is the case later on. Charging up to block while also throwing out the spinny special is going to be your bread and butter here to beat enemies. You're also going to need Zeus's special boon for this to work at all. The special on aspect of Zeus triggers continuously while floating in the air, allowing Zeus's lightning damage to trigger each time. It's great in a casual run if you haven't tried it yet, but for 64 heat, it is the bare minimum. Explosive Return is going to be our go-to hammer because of the large AoE and high base damage that it has. No other hammer really provides enough to be viable at all, so I'm afraid this is going to be mandatory. And even then, you're going to need another major source of damage eventually from boons like Static Discharge, Zeus's Aid, or Dionysus's Aid. Or more likely, you're probably going to need 2 out of 3 of those boons actually. And we're not even going to bother to mention really nice to have boons like Athena's Dash here just because, well, it's just a lot to ask for and you'll see why. So why are these mandatory exactly? Well, it mostly comes down to tight deadline. You see, you can't just turtle the whole thing out and slowly whittle away at the enemies since you only get 5 minutes per zone. You're required to kill them quickly and efficiently, which means that you need a lot of damage. Tight deadline means that you cannot simply get whatever the game gives you and do your best with it. You actually need the game to offer you specific things that are going to do some work. If the deadline runs out, you start taking 5 damage a second every second until you clear the current zone. So after speaking with the community, we all agreed that this build setup is the bare minimum necessary to have a chance at beating 64 heat. And by the way, they all agreed that an epic special boon from Zeus is required as well to start out. Keep in mind that this bare minimum build that I'm discussing here isn't a safe way to beat 64 heat. You're actually going to need a ton more stuff on top of this, but this is a good way to get started, I guess you could say. Well, let's take a break from the build to remind ourselves of some of the problems with 64 heat. First, you cannot heal at all because of lasting consequences. The closest thing to it would be to get some max health, which will also increase your current health. You also have no death defiances or a stubborn defiance because of routine inspection, and you cannot purchase or find any like you normally would. That means that if you get hit at all, you will never get that health back. Enemies also hit 100% harder, move and attack 40% faster, have more health, they have 2 shields because of damage control. Oh, and also, you only got 1 dash, 1 cast, and 50 health. Now, some people have beaten 64 heat by either routing out a run using a seed or by using some mods to guarantee some boons. This is incredibly impressive, and these runners really should be applauded for their accomplishments. Honestly, there have only been 2 players that have actually beaten a modded 64 heat run, and both of those happened this year. These players are absolute powerhouses at the game, and they really deserve our recognition for it. Now, most of these modded players will simply make the game guarantee getting the special boon and maybe explosive return to reduce the number of resets that are going to happen. However, that's probably not what we have in mind when we think of someone beating 64 heat. We'd like to imagine that there is some player out there that will make the best of a bad situation and overcome the massive hurdle with their own skill. But there is a lot more to overcome before you can even start discussing skill levels. Enter approval process. You see, with approval process on, you will no longer be able to select boons or hammers and will simply be forced into one option. This inherently means that you are now required to get very lucky in order to even stand a chance against this heat. One of the reasons that this pact impacts the run so significantly is that the number of attempts required to get even a run started skyrockets with it on. This, coupled with some other packs such as routine inspection that will remove your rerolls and every other benefit from the mirror, mean that you have almost no chance of getting meaningful boons. This leads into the biggest problem with this challenge, which is the sheer number of attempts and time it takes to even begin playing. You see, in order to prove that your run is not seeded, you'll need to show a death in your recording. And if your run is off to a bad start, then you'll need to take a death in order to reset the seed. Simply hitting give up from the menu will not work since the next run will actually start with the same seed. This results in you needing to walk back from the blood pit to the pact to start a new run, which might not seem crazy, but I think it's finally time to bring something important into this equation: math. So let's go back to our requirements to get a run started. Step 1, we need Zeus's special boon and we need it to be epic. Let's assume that you're going to start your attempts with Zeus's keepsake because rolling a natural epic Zeus special without it is a 0.15% chance for your first boon at this heat. So when you start a run in Hades, there's a 25% chance of a hammer being in Chamber 1 instead of a boon. But for simplicity, let's leave that out of the equation just for now, and let's assume that you'll only get a boon in Chamber 1. You're guaranteed to get offered one of 4 core boons since it's your first boon: the attack, special, cast, or dash. We have to get the special, so that means it's a 1 in 4 or 25% chance with approval process on. But remember, we need the boon to be epic as well, which is a 15% chance when you're wearing Zeus's keepsake. These two factors alone mean that you only have a 3.75% chance of getting the necessary boon. To put that into perspective, only 3 or 4 out of 100 attempts would even leave Chamber 1 because of this restriction. So let's go back to the hammer. So if you do get a hammer drop in Chamber 1, we have to get explosive return in order to have enough damage to beat the deadline. There are 9 possible hammer options for Zeus's aspects, so that's a 1 in 9 chance of being able to leave Chamber 1 if there was a hammer. But then you'd still be required to get that Zeus special after hitting that 11% chance for explosive return. These 2 upgrades might be enough to leave Tartarus assuming everything else goes right, but eventually you're gonna need some more stuff. The top picks are Static Discharge, Zeus's Aid, or Dionysus's Aid in order to get anywhere near enough damage to clear the enemies quickly enough. Now this gets a little bit harder to calculate, and this might be more of an estimate, but I'm sure you can imagine what that might look like if there was only a 1 in 8 chance of seeing a specific god. And even if you do run into, let's say, Dionysus with no other boons filled in yet, the odds of getting the call at that point are about 9.5%. And you're probably not going to have a single reroll. So let's recap a tiny bit here. We need to get an epic Zeus special, and we need explosive return from a hammer room, all before the end of Tartarus. There are many more things that would actually need to happen as well, such as not dying, but the odds of having just these 2 things happen are only 0.416%. This means that only 1 in 240 attempts would actually give you the bare minimum to maybe leave Tartarus. If we want to try to factor in getting a second source of damage that we discussed before the end of Asphodel, the odds turn out to be somewhere around 1 in 1,700 attempts. So, of course, for this video, I did the only sane thing that a person would do, and I did many attempts and timed it all. It took about 45 seconds to reach the pact again after a false start, and that's only if you're being really efficient, honestly. Only 1 in 27 runs will actually leave Chamber 1, which means that you'll get to leave Chamber 1 once every 20 minutes or so. But even after Chamber 1, we're gonna need more like we discussed. Let's say you got the Epic Zeus boon in Chamber 1. We're still going to need Explosive Return, and we need it fast. This is a bit tougher to figure out, but let's say that you run into the hammer about 5 minutes into a run where you did get that special boon. I would say this is actually quite generous, since the few attempts I did even see a hammer were well past the 5-minute mark. Once you see the hammer, you have a 1 in 9 chance of getting Explosive Return. With all things factored in, you'll only get an Epic Zeus special and Explosive Return every 3 hours and 45 minutes if you play non-stop. And then keep in mind that this is the bare minimum to leave Tartarus. Now, I did get a run about halfway through Asphodel with a common Zeus special and no Explosive Return, but with the timer encroaching, you could tell it wasn't going much further. I was actually quite lucky in some ways too. We saw Boldy, Thanatos, and a Fountain Room in that run already. But just because a build was able to reach this point, it does not mean that it had the strength to beat the run. Now, I know what you're thinking, that it's still possible without all these specific things, and maybe you're right. But as someone who has pushed the heat limits, trust me when I say that the reality of this is actually even more grim than what I'm painting here. You just need way more luck than just what I've listed. Even if your dreams come true and you get all the boons you want, you're nowhere near guaranteed to have the luck required to win. You're going to need things like Fountain Rooms, Event Rooms, Thanatos, and good enemy patterns are massive here to even stand a chance at surviving tight deadline. Let's say you beat the odds and manage to get a strong build going. Maybe you don't get everything on the list, but you're feeling good and manage to blow out Lerny. You will then enter the Pit of Despair, Elysium. This is where hope and joy go to die at 64 heat. The soul spawns will absolutely devastate whatever time you may have managed to save up until this point, and getting unlucky enemy spawns like endless bright swords just mean game over. Even Paddy can't save us since 2 of his buffs do literally nothing, and the 3rd is really mediocre with this build. But if you somehow scrounge your way through and surpass Elysium, expunge the heroes, and wave hello to our good shade, there is one more inescapable doom still waiting for you. The Satyr's Sack. There are no tricks, no tips, no secrets to getting the sack. There are a lot of superstitions out there around it, but the sad truth is it is a simple 56.8% chance of getting the sack on the second path. Essentially a coin flip at the end of a miserable run. Maybe you could have saved enough time to take 3 paths if you had to, but realistically, no. Just no. And if we factor this into our current odds, our chances get reduced to 0.236%, or a measly 1 in 422 attempts. And then, even then, if you manage to get past this hellscape, and then you still have the ultimate challenge left. Super Dad. You're going to need a solid 4 to 5 minutes to beat him, even with an ideal setup, and that means you'll have to have saved a huge chunk of time throughout the run. You'll also be at the mercy of some terrifying mob summons in Phase 1. If you get bad luck and Hades decides to summon 3 butterfly balls, it's over. You're going to have to execute every block, every special, every cast perfectly. Not just to avoid being damaged, but to also deal enough damage yourself to complete the run in time. So with only some of the factors calculated in, the odds of getting a run that is even plausible is about 0.0147%, or 1 in 6,802 attempts. Even if you only use the 45 seconds to reset in Chamber 1 as an example, that's 1 plausible run every 85 hours worth of attempts. Is it possible? Yes. Is it reasonable? Absolutely not. Is there someone out there willing to put in the painstaking work, the endless amounts of hours, the blood, the sweat, the tears? I hope so. I'd like to thank the Hades High Heat community for helping me out with this video. Special shoutouts to Seagull and Angelic especially. If you're interested in more roguelike content, please consider subscribing, and I promise cute cat photos will appear. Thanks again. See you later. This time...